When I was in graduate school, I had the privilege of working as a graduate assistant with a number of undergrad students. I've told you before how I worked at the university switchboard, and my job was to answer phone calls, and we had to man a lot of shifts. The switchboard opened at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it closed at 11 o'clock at night, and so there were a lot of student workers that we had to hire. And over the 5 years that I worked in that capacity, I worked with a number of these students. I wish I could say I remembered all their names and faces. I thought the other day I need to get my old yearbooks out and go through them because I cannot remember everyone I worked with over the years. But there was one girl in particular that I think I will always remember. She was a nursing major that, if my memory serves correct, was from the state of Arizona. We had worked together for a couple of years when one day during her senior year, she showed up to work, and I could tell by looking at her that something was wrong. When she came to work, she sat down to my left, and she was just clearly agitated, so I did what I think anybody normally would do. I asked her if she was okay. And she said, "Well, yeah, I'm okay, but I just received a notice from the Dean of Women's office, and they want me to come by and talk to them." Well, there could be many different reasons why the Dean of Women was calling her to have a conversation, but I could tell from the way my coworker was acting that she knew what the reason was going to be, and she knew it was not going to be good. And all through the shift, you could see her face that she was dreading whatever was going to come her way later that day. But what I did not expect was that this would be the last time I ever saw this girl at the switchboard. To this day, I don't exactly know what happened. I don't know what the problem was. Apparently, she got involved with something that she was not supposed to be involved with. She made some decisions that were frankly bad decisions, and she was dismissed from nursing school, and she was dismissed from the school itself. In fact, I remember my supervisor telling us that she would not be returning to work and that she had been sent home. And I ached for her. She was a bright girl. She was gifted, determined to get through her program, but she apparently had made some bad choices. She knew she had made some bad choices, and now she was dealing with the consequences of not being able to graduate with her nursing degree with the cohort that she had been with. And to be honest, at some point along the summer, I kind of forgot about her. The school year ended. I went through the summer months. The new fall semester started. We got the influx of our student workers again, and we moved through that new school year. And this girl, of course, never returned. I never saw her. And throughout the school year, as any school year, things take place, and we moved forward. Well, near the end of that next year, I had another coworker that I had worked closely beside for about 2 years. She also was a nursing major. And if you're familiar with nursing programs, at the end of the year, of course, they have a nursing pinning ceremony. And in this case, they had a reception as well. Well, since I was close friends with this girl, I wanted to make sure I got by the reception to congratulate her. And I stopped by the reception hall where this event was taking place. And she was there with family and some friends, and they were celebrating. And I got to congratulate her for all the hard work. And I decided to take a moment and just walk around the room and just watch these students. And they were, of course, celebrating. They were excited, graduating, moving on to other things in life. And I was moving around the room. I noticed there was a girl at the very end of the line at a table, and nobody was around. I didn't even really pick out who it was until I got closer, and I realized it was the same girl that had been dismissed from school the year before. And as you could expect, I went up to her, and I was quite shocked. I was surprised, and I called out her name, and I said, "Hey," I said, "what in the world are you doing here?" And she told me, she said, "After I was dismissed," again, I didn't ask her what that was for. I didn't want to know. But she said, "After I was dismissed, I was determined to come back to the nursing program and finish out my degree." And she said, "I returned." And she had to retake all the classes that she had missed out on the semester before. She had lived in town. She had not come back to work at the switchboard. And but she was determined to come back and finish her degree. She had just finished it up. I guess being from the state of Arizona, she didn't have a lot of family who was able to join her for that. I'm not sure where that all that took place. But she was just thankful to be able to finish the program, to be able to move on with life. And I must confess, the girl really impressed me. Because after all her failure, after her mistakes, she could have been very embittered. She could have chosen not to complete her program. But that's not what she did. Instead, she chose to face her mistakes. She chose to return to the program. She was restored to her place, and she was moving forward in the plan that God had for her life. Now, I'll tell you that story because there are many people in life who can identify with that student. Perhaps you're here this morning and you say, "Yeah, I've had moments like that in my life." Perhaps there are mistakes that someone has committed in their life, decisions that were made that they look back on and they just kind of shake their head and they go, "Well, how in the world could I have ever made those decisions?" Results that maybe proved disastrous, even to the point where you've wondered, Has God forsaken me? Has he put me on a shelf and I'm no longer going to be able to be useful for Christ? Well, this morning we're going to look at the last chapter in John's Gospel because it's in this chapter that we discover Jesus Christ moving to reinstitute, to really establish Peter and recover him from the fall that he had taken that we have been exploring over the last several weeks. And I must admit, this chapter is a fascinating chapter to me. This is one of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. In fact, it is the most extensive post-resurrection experience that we have recorded within the Gospel records. And what's intriguing about it is it's filled with all kinds of interesting conversations and little details that give color to the story. And folks, it's also interesting because there's a different tone and a different feel to this chapter. For instance, you do have Jesus at kind of an intimate moment with his disciples on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. You have been coming in from a night of fishing. There's some beauty, no doubt, in the setting as the sun is coming up over the Golan Heights. Daniel, is this thing on as well as if I just move this mic? Does this sound okay to you? Are y'all fine? Okay. This sounds louder to me up here. Very good. So they are coming in from fishing. The sun is coming up over the Golan Heights, if you're familiar with northern Galilee or northern Israel area. You have the fish sizzling above the fire. You have warm bread. There's no crowds. It's kind of serene. I imagine it's a quiet morning, and it's just a very peaceful setting. And the fact is that Jesus has an agenda that morning. You can see it in verse 1 and in verse 14. Look there, please. It says in verse 1 that after these things, Jesus showed himself alive again to his disciples. And then verse 14 is very similar. Now, this is the third time that Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was risen from the dead. In other words, this is the third time Jesus has come to these men as a group of disciples. If you're curious about the first two times, you can read about them in John chapter 20. But this is the third occasion that as a group, he's coming to these men. And folks, on this third occasion, it says that Jesus is manifesting himself to these men. And what it means by that is not just making a physical appearance, although he did that, but he is revealing something of his character and of his nature when he shows up the third time to them. And what Jesus is going to do is show us how he deals with a man that has made a great mistake. And of course, that man is Peter. In fact, the next time we are together, which will be a few weeks, I'm headed out of town this afternoon, but the next time we're together, Jesus is going to deal most directly with Peter in verses 15 through 18. There's going to be a direct confrontation with Peter. But everything we have before us this morning in verses 1 through 14 is Jesus setting the stage to deal with the Apostle Peter after he has fallen, after he has denied even knowing Christ. And folks, as Jesus sets the stage for this restoration, I'm contending this morning, he is showing us some of how he deals in the hearts of his sheep who often go astray, just like Peter does. The fact is that while Peter is the central figure in the story, you can make the argument, all these men have had some level of failure. Remember, they all deserted Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. All these men fled in fear. None of them wanted to be associated with Jesus at that point. So in a sense, he is restoring all these men, but it's very clear. Peter is the prime target in this whole chapter and the prime target in the conversation. So I've entitled this message, Jesus Recovers a Fallen Disciple. It is a two-part message. We'll deal with the second part, Lord willing, in a few weeks. But folks, we're going to jump right into the passage this morning, and we're going to see how Jesus responds to a disciple who's already demonstrated a contrition, a repentance. Remember, he went out sorrowing last time we dealt with him when he denied Christ. But what we're going to see is how Jesus deals with a very humbled, very repentant disciple like this. The first thing I do want you to notice is the setting again. When you read verse 1, it quickly becomes apparent that these disciples are back on their home turf. Verse 1 tells us that this episode takes place at the Sea of Tiberias. Now, I think that's intriguing. I have to stop and just give you some information very briefly. You're familiar with this body of water because it's called the Sea of Galilee. But in this case, it's called the Sea of Tiberias because Herod Antipas built a city on the western shores of this body of water that he named for Emperor Tiberius to honor him, and it was called Tiberias. It was present in Jesus' day. You can visit that city today. It still exists. However, over the decades, by the time John writes this, many decades later from Jesus' ministry, it became the dominant city, and as a result, that body of water was called the Sea of Tiberias as well. If I'm not mistaken, this is the only place in the New Testament it's called the Sea of Tiberias, and it reflects decades later when John writes this gospel record. Now, verse 2 explains who was gathered. It tells us Simon Peter was there. And the next name is kind of interesting to us. It's Thomas is there as well. You say, why is Thomas listed second when this is the only time in the Gospels Thomas's name follows Peter. And the only possible explanation I know is because back in chapter 20, Thomas was absent the first time Jesus showed up. And of course, you know the whole story of doubting Thomas. But now it's almost as if Thomas has met the risen Lord, and he is not going to be anywhere separated from Peter because Peter is still the de facto leader of the group, and he wants to make sure that as the Lord shows up to Peter again, Thomas wants to be there as well. That's just kind of reading between the lines, but that appears to be why Thomas is second in the list. Of course, Nathanael of Canaan, he's there as well. Then you have the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, they're there. And two unnamed disciples. We don't know why their names are not mentioned, but they are not. So what you have are 7 disciples, and they're all with Peter. Now, the question becomes, why are they in Galilee? Maybe some of you can answer that. Why are they in Galilee? When you see them in chapter 20, they're still in Jerusalem, but why are they in Galilee? That's right, exactly. When Jesus rose from the dead, that first resurrection day, Jesus sent a message to them saying, I'm going to meet you in Galilee. So they are in Galilee because Jesus told them to be in Galilee. You say, why did Jesus tell them to go to Galilee? Well, I'm going to suggest, in part, is to help them recover from all the shocking experiences they have encountered in Jerusalem. Remember, the heat was on in Jerusalem. They thought themselves to be hunted men in Jerusalem. They thought there was a big bullseye on their back in Jerusalem. Some of them were still cowering, it looks like, perhaps in the upper room or some other room in Jerusalem. They were afraid perhaps to move about. And it's quite a very, very hard situation to be in that very tense situation after the Passover. And of course, they went into the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and they had to be in Jerusalem for that as well. So it's a rough week for them to be in Jerusalem. But folks, they needed to get back home where there were no crowds, no hectic pace, no shouting fans. They would have had some calm, some relief that they would have experienced. Calm and from the constant strain, the travel, the busyness, the misunderstandings, the teachings, the excitement, the discouragement. I think Jesus wanted them back in Galilee to kind of decompress. We use that term sometimes, to kind of decompress, to get off the emotional roller coaster that they had been on for really 2 or 3 weeks leading up to this point. So here they are in Galilee. Verse 3 says that Peter claims he wants to go fishing. And so these other 6 disciples say, we're going to go with you, Peter. Now, I know it's been popular at some points of turning Peter's statement, I go fishing, into kind of a negative statement. A lot of people kind of accuse Peter of wanting to to kind of divest himself of his discipleship, and he's going to go right back into his former life. But folks, I personally do not think that kind of criticism is warranted. I would simply just ask the question for anybody who holds that position, what exactly do you expect Peter to do when he's back in Galilee? Is he supposed to just sit around and twiddle his thumbs waiting for the Lord to show up? I don't think so. Remember, Peter is a family man. We know he has a wife, probably had some kids, I don't know. And folks, if Peter doesn't make a living, they're going to starve. And so Peter does the honorable thing. He says, I know how to fish. That's been my occupation. He's going to go out and go fishing. And the rest of the guys, maybe they needed to go fishing as well. Maybe they just wanted to spend time with Peter. They're not letting Peter out of their sight because the Lord's appeared to him a couple of times or so. And they're saying, I'm going with you too, Peter. So Peter goes fishing. Nothing wrong with that. And it does say in verse 3 that these men stayed out all night and they did not catch one single fish. Now, again, I need to help you understand the cultural context. We go fishing today. We usually take a rod and reel. That's how most of us go fishing. They didn't know anything about rod and reels back then. They had fishing nets. And if you're familiar with Middle Eastern fishermen, and some people still do it this way, typically these nets are often circular in nature, and they have weights on the edges of the circular net, and they would throw them out and kind of spin them around so that they would plop onto the water, and as they sink down, they would hopefully trap some fish underneath that, and they could kind of pull the lines in and trap the fish, and that's how they would fish. Sometimes they would use drag nets, and that would be these long nets that they would stretch from one side of the shore to another shore, and they'd kind of pull it in, and anything that was near the shoreline, they would pull in the nets as well. We don't know exactly all the kinds of different fishing that Peter did, but he's definitely out there in the water. All night long, he has been throwing these nets into the water, dragging them in. And as far as I can determine, it's been a couple of years since Peter, James, and John, or any of these men, have done any kind of fishing like this. The last time was probably the passage we read in Luke chapter 5, where Jesus calls these men into what I've called full-time Christian ministry, and he has called them to follow him faithfully for those years. So can you imagine how tired these men have been? Can you imagine how sore their muscles must be? You say, oh, they're experienced, but they haven't done it in 2 years. And I'm telling you, throwing some of those nets that were kind of heavy and dragging them in over and over all night long trying to catch some fish, these men had to be tired. They had to be weary. Their muscles were probably getting cramped and sore at this point. And they are, let me say it this way, they're probably counting on this night of fish to be able to help feed their families, maybe pay some bills as well. But there's nothing. So, important question. Do you think it escaped Peter and James and John's memory that the last time they were doing this activity, they had the same results? You think there was any deja vu going on in their mind, going, I think we've had an occasion like this where we fished all night and we didn't catch anything. Folks, I mean, most guys that practice their trade or go out, I know some of you guys who do hunting, you remember your hunts. You remember what happened and what took place. And so I don't think it passed their memory that they think, last time we were out here, we didn't catch anything else either. And remember, the Lord came along at that point and he called us to follow him as well. I imagine John was reminding Peter about that, and James was over there telling the other guys, last time we were out here, this is exactly the kind of results we had. Folks, I don't think it escaped their notice at all. But however, 2 years have passed. These are not the same men that went fishing in Luke chapter 5. These are men who have been following Jesus for 2 years, at least faithfully, and maybe longer than that. There have been some hard lessons learned. And I'm suggesting it could not have passed their notice that these kinds of circumstances were eerily similar to what they experienced before. So another question. Do you think there's anything in that for us this morning? Do you think that God actually uses events like this to prepare our hearts for his future working in our lives? Or I can ask the question this way. Do you think God allows certain events to rhyme with our past to get us to think about our relationship to him? Folks, I like to suggest I don't think so. I know that the Lord does this. I know the Lord does this. I know that there are times when God will work through circumstances of life to recall to your mind past events where the Lord stepped into your life and did a work in a way that really surprised you or shocked you. The last time this did happen to Peter when he called him into full-time Christian ministry. Jesus is arranging these very uncanny similarities because Jesus is at work in the heart of a man who I feel like still feels he is very defeated in his spirit over that night that he denied even knowing Jesus, cursing, trying to convince everybody he was not a disciple. In fact, you can go to the Old Testament and you can see examples of this in the life of a man named Jacob. You remember Jacob's failures? Remember this man? He lies to his father. He really basically steals the birthright of his brother. He has to flee for his life, ruptures that whole family, is gone for years. In fact, when he comes back, his mother has died. He no longer has the opportunity to see his father or his mother. And do you remember how God encouraged Jacob as he's on his flight away from his brother Esau at a place called Bethel? Remember that occasion? Well, folks, if you read Jacob's life carefully, you will discover that at another time of his discouragement, at another time of potential failure and uncertainty, God calls Jacob back to Bethel. It's over 20 years later in Jacob's life. His family is back in the land of Canaan, but Jacob has grown afraid because two of his sons, Simeon and Levi, have decided to take revenge for the abuse that the men of Shechem has wreaked upon their sister Diana. And they have gone in to deceive the men of Shechem, and they have slaughtered the men of Shechem. And Jacob was worried about the response that the men of the greater region would have toward his family. And Jacob he just knew they were going to be annihilated. And God calls Jacob back to Bethel. You say, why is that? Because it was at Bethel 20 years or more previous in Jacob's life that God made promises to Jacob. It was at Bethel that God demonstrated his faithfulness to Jacob, and he wanted Jacob to remember all that work that God did in his life all those years previously. It was a way of reassuring Jacob that God was not through with Jacob. God's promises would not be void to Jacob. It was a way to really recover Jacob from that pit of fear into which he was falling. And I'd like to suggest this morning that God will do that in the lives of his people. Sometimes when we are at our lowest, or maybe when our fear is heightened, or maybe when we are facing some failure, and we think maybe God's abandoned us, maybe God has just deserted us and cannot use us, God will arrange the circumstances of our lives to often remind us of his past workings. I could say it this way, God is not a fair weather friend. Just because you are unfaithful in a moment of time, just because there's some failure, doesn't mean that God is just going to desert you. That is not the nature of who our God is. That is what Jesus is manifesting to his disciples. In fact, I remember an occasion like this in my life. It happened right before I moved here as your pastor. I had never been a pastor before. I had lots of uncertainties and fears in my heart. But one of the things God allowed me to experience before I moved here was visiting a church building, a small country church building in the state of Alabama where I had attended VBS as a small boy. I hadn't been in that building for 25 years. But I still remember as this little 6, 7-year-old boy being in that building and being aware of the presence of God in my life, of God working in my life. I remember the layout of the building. I remember where the Sunday school rooms were. I remember just the sense of the reverence of God in that building, even as a 6 and 7-year-old boy. And I remember God working in my heart even during those times as my kid. And I remember that God was being faithful to me. And God brought all those memories back over all those years of where he had taken me from the time I was a child to this point now of stepping into a pulpit like this. And God was recalling those past memories to me. God does that in the lives of his people. He will put you in places where you're forced to remember past workings he did in your life. It might be visiting an old bedroom that you haven't stepped foot in 30 years. It might be that God has providentially arranged your path to come across the path of an old Sunday school teacher, and you haven't seen them or talked to them in 20 years. And it's like God just providentially arranged that opportunity and that conversation at a moment in your life where you were shaken, at a moment in your life of your failure or your fears, and God uses that to remind you of how he has worked in your past and to convince you that he's not faithful with you. He's not done with you. He will be faithful to you. He will see his word fulfilled in you. And you leave that conversation or that setting or that environment encouraged and strengthened that God has always been faithful to you. Well, this is what's happening in this passage. Now, having set the stage, Jesus in verses 4 through 14 is going to prepare Peter's heart for the conversation he must have with Peter. And again, in preparing Peter's heart, he is going to use things from Peter's life and Peter's memory. For instance, look at verse 4. It says, "But when the morning was now come, Jesus stood on the shore, just like he did in Luke 5, except in that case, he was actually in the boat with Peter. And it says in this case, they didn't know it was Jesus, and there might have been a reason for that. We read this morning in verse 8 that they were not that far from land, but they were far enough from land that if you do the conversions, I think it was 200 something in the text, I forget what the word was, it's about 100 yards away. They were about 100 yards out into the water off the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And so from that distance, they may not have been able to recognize this man walking as actually Jesus. But Jesus in verse 5 raises his voice and shouts out, "Children," or lads, "have you any meat?" In other words, have you caught anything all night? How's the fishermen going? Now, Jesus knows they didn't catch anything. He's aware of that. Why do you think he asked the question? What's that? See if they would lie? Yeah, well, they're fishermen. Maybe they would. I don't know. No doubt to get them to think about the last time they were out there, they didn't catch anything either. Now, they've probably already put 2 and 2 together, but it really makes the point pretty sharp in their memory. They're going to have to admit, and they do admit, no, we haven't caught anything. So verse 6, Jesus does again what he did 2 years ago when he says, "Cast the net on the right side of the ship, and ye shall find." Now, I don't know what they thought about that. I know the last time Jesus told Peter to do that, remember Peter kind of gently objected. He said, we've been out here all night. This is a waste of time. I don't want to do this. But, we'll do it, Jesus. This time, there doesn't appear to be any objection. They just throw the net in. And folks, they got such a great catch of fish, they weren't able to draw it into the boat. In fact, it was just too heavy. I don't know if you've ever tried to drag anything out of the river or out of the creek or something like that. And, you just know how something's so waterlogged and so heavy and you're trying to bring it into your boat. It almost pulls you in. That's kind of the experience these men are having. Now, I don't know who all counted those fish, but verse 11 says there were 153 fish in that net. That's quite a haul. Somebody counted them. I don't know if it was Peter, John, James. There's some people in life, they're just kind of fixated on numbers and they want to count everything. Somebody went down there and counted all that up. I don't know who. But at this point, I'm sure that Peter again is having deja vu. He's remembering the last time Jesus did exactly this kind of work in his life. And that was again back in Luke chapter 5. They know that Jesus is at work in their life again. And men and women, it must be a wonderful experience when Jesus comes alongside and does something like this that assures you he's still with you. He hasn't abandoned you, that he is at work. He's trying to move you past perhaps some failure, some sorrow in your life, some past failings. And some of you may have thought, Jesus will never use me again. He'll never do this. And he may let you think that for some while. For Peter, it's been about 3 weeks now. For you, it may have been 3 years or more. I don't know. But sometimes the Lord allows you to think that, but then he will work at some point, reminding you again of times he has worked. He has not forgotten you. And in this case, John just says to Peter in verse 7, it's the Lord. It's the Lord. I mean, it's like You ever had the light bulb moment turn on? It's like, boom, there's a light bulb. This is clearly the Lord at work. That's Him. Now, everything that we have looked at sets in motion what we're about to explore next. I don't want you to miss this. When Peter heard that it was the Lord, in verse 7, Peter girt his fisher's coat into him, for he was naked, and he cast himself into the sea. And there's been a lot of debate and a lot of ink spilled over what does it mean Peter was naked. Does that mean literally completely without clothes? Possibly. My guess is that he at least had his undergarments on, maybe a loincloth, something like that. Maybe that was what it was. We don't know for sure exactly the degree of nakedness here. But he did throw himself into the sea. Now, what do you think about Peter throwing himself into the sea? Think that's a little odd? On the one hand, I initially think that's odd. And here's why. They're just 100 yards out. They're in a boat. And 100 yards is a decent amount to swim. You know, I'm not a swimmer. In fact, I've had certified lifeguards try to teach me to swim, and I just sink and they gave up on me. I don't swim. I'm not afraid of water, but I don't swim. But I think 100 yards is quite a distance to swim. And it may be getting, cold, frigid water early in the morning. I don't know. I think it's a little odd that Peter does this. But here's another question. Are you surprised Peter threw himself into the sea? You're like, nah, this sounds about right for Peter, right? I mean, here's a man that's impetuous. He kind of rushes in when he should really walk in. He speaks when he should be quiet. He responds without thinking and not realizing the repercussions of what he's going to say. And that's not a good thing. And that's Peter. And we kind of hear Peter's name and we kind of smile because we know Peter's like this. But folks, I want to ask you, what do you think the other men in that boat were thinking as they watched Peter throw himself into the water and swim away? You think they're thinking, boy, that's good old Peter. He just loves the Lord so much. I just wish I could love the Lord as much as Peter loves the Lord. Do you think that's what they're thinking? I don't think that's what they're thinking. And I don't think if you were in that boat, you would be thinking the same thing. Let me suggest maybe what they're thinking. Maybe it goes along these lines. There goes Peter again, jumping in without thinking, completely forgotten about us. I mean, we do have this net full of 153 fish. Yeah. Some of y'all are like, yeah, I got friends like that. When the heavy lifting happens, all of a sudden they disappear. Yeah, that's Peter. Here's the heavy 153 fish. Got to bring them to shore. And does Peter ever consider maybe we'd like to see Jesus as well? No, not Peter. I imagine those were the kind of thoughts running through James's mind and John's mind and Nathaniel and Thomas. And they know the guy. They know exactly what he's like. You say, why are these disciples thinking that? Why does Peter jump in so brashly and impetuously? You see, folks, it's because Peter has a problem in his thinking and in his disposition that led to that great failure in his life 3 weeks ago. And I'm suggesting this is part of the evidence. Jesus is deliberately creating this environment to bring out the problem once again, to highlight it for us. In fact, what I need to do is just briefly take you back a few weeks again into Peter's life. It won't take long for me to do this. But you recall the night that Jesus Christ was betrayed. You remember that those disciples were involved in an argument. You all remember this. The argument was who of them is going to be greatest in the kingdom. Even though Jesus is warning them of the dangers, they keep arguing who's the greatest. And it was Peter who basically threw the rest of the men under the school bus, right? He threw them under the bus. Remember, Jesus predicted, middle of the argument. They're still arguing. He says, now listen, one of you are going to betray me. And he says, all of you are going to be offended, and all of you are going to flee. You remember what Peter said when he heard that? He said, Lord, that may be true of the rest of the guys. That's where he threw them under the bus. Not me. What does that reveal about Peter's attitude when it comes to the rest of those men? It reveals I'm better than them. I'm better than the rest of these guys. I am the preeminent disciple. Oh, they do love you. I don't doubt that. But if you want to talk about someone who really loves you, Jesus, someone who's always going to be there for you, someone who's always going to be faithful to Jesus, who will always stand for you, Jesus, who will even die for you, Jesus, those guys ain't going to do it. I will. I'm the preeminent disciple. And because of that lofty opinion of himself, Peter would say things like, well, you know what? I'll be more faithful to you. Or do you remember the occasion when there was a storm on the Sea of Galilee and Peter's the only one that said, Lord, may I come out to you? Now, there was a lot of faith in that. I am in no way a deny. He was the only one that said it. Why do you think Peter said that? I mean, would you get out of the boat? You were there with 11 other guys. Why did Peter want to get out of the boat? Okay. I would suggest, based on everything we know about Peter's life, this is Peter playing the one-upmanship game. I got to one-up everybody else. I got to show everybody else how much I love Jesus. And yeah, it would have been a cool thing to walk on water, I guess you could say it that way, but I think behind a little bit of that was some pride in Peter's heart. That I got to show everybody how great and wonderful I am and how faithful and how devoted I am to Jesus. And folks, Peter has a problem of continuing to put himself out there as more important than the rest of these men, and it's straining the relationship within the apostolic company. It really is. In fact, Peter's tendency was to leave the rest of those men behind because he was so zealous for the Lord. He is zealous. There's no question. He loves the Lord. But Peter thinks that his special attachment to Jesus is greater than the rest of those men. And what he has is, frankly, a self-centered, prideful love for Jesus. Did you know you can have a self-centered, prideful love for Jesus? You can. You can think you're more devoted and more loving and more sacrificial than anybody else around you, and you can have this prideful, self-centered love for Jesus. And that's what got Peter into trouble that night. It's why he thought he could go into the high priest residence and really stand for Jesus and thought he would be okay because he was the preeminent disciple. And what you're finding in this passage is that attitude has not been hammered out of him yet. He's still doing crazy things to try to one-up all the rest of those disciples. And folks, there's no arguing again that Peter was the leader of the company. I mean, when he said, I'm going fishing, the rest of them says, go. I mean, they all admitted he was kind of a magnet kind of guy. He was the kind of guy that men follow. There's no question about that. They all said, we're going to follow after. But Jesus is going to have to deal with this man about his pride and about his self-centered love for him. And I mean, if Peter keeps expressing it in the ways he's been expressing it, he is going to fracture the company of this little disciple. And these are the men Jesus is leaving behind to carry on his work. He's going to have to deal with this in Peter's life. In fact, what do you think Jesus was thinking as he saw Peter swimming to shore? I mean, I'm sure Jesus knew it was Peter. What do you think was going on in Peter or Jesus' mind as he's watching this man stroke after stroke getting closer to him to shore, leaving the other guys behind? I think Jesus is thinking, I got to deal with this. I'm glad Peter loves me, but his self-focused love for me has to be confronted. I got to deal with it. And so in verse 8, the rest of the disciples finally make it to shore, dragging the catch with them. And when they arrive, they find Jesus has a fire going. The fish is cooking, and there's bread laid out for them. Jesus has provided a meal for them. I love the setting because, remember, right before his crucifixion, he also had another meal in which he was the host. The Lord's table, we observed it last week. But now they're having a meal again, and this time it's after his resurrection. But notice this in verse 10. Jesus says, bring of the fish which ye now have caught. In other words, I've got the meal started. We need a few more fish. Got 7 guys, 8 guys here. Only so much fits in the frying pan. We got to have a few more. But notice how it's worded. It says in this passage that he said to them, plural. He wanted there to be 2 or 3 or 4 guys go down there, pick some out. But notice what happens. What happens is Peter himself goes down there by himself, hauls that net full of 153 fish onto the shore all by himself. Would you say Peter seems to be a pretty strong guy? I've never drug 153 fish. I don't know how big these fish were, but I don't think I could do that by myself. Peter, I think, is a pretty strong guy. However, what I'd like to suggest is this is another illustration of Peter's problem. Jesus said to them, plural, and Peter goes, forget everybody else. I can do it myself. Let me go show Jesus again how much I love him. I'll go do this, and it's all about Peter showing off. Peter showing off. Now, I know the text doesn't say this, but I feel fairly certain the disciples are probably rolling their eyes at Peter. I think they're probably glancing at one another and go, well, there he goes again. He jumped in the boat and left us, and Jesus wanted more of us to go. There he goes again. I can imagine they're rolling their eyes, not getting a chance to help. But you see, Jesus is setting Peter up. That's what he's doing. He's setting him up. He's allowing all this to come to the surface of Peter's heart and how he relates to these other men. He's setting them up. And in fact, notice that Jesus actually ends up, I'm going to argue, contrasting Peter's impetuous response with one of his genuine servanthood responses. So what do you mean? In verse 12, Jesus says, come and dine. Come and dine. Again, reminders of past events. Just a few weeks previous, Jesus had invited them to a meal, and Jesus was the host. And what happened during that meal? John chapter 13, what happens in that meal? Remember, they're arguing about the greatest, and Jesus teaches them a very powerful lesson about servanthood. What does Jesus do? He washes their feet. He says, I'm the Lord amongst you, I'm the master, but I'm going to wash your feet. Now, that's an attitude Peter has no interest in. Okay? He's all about proving how great I am. And Jesus says, you're so far off the mark, Peter. And so there's a sense in which Jesus, when he says, come and dine on this occasion, he's reminding them, last time we had a meal together, y'all had this big argument, y'all were competing with one another, and I just served you. And that's the lesson he has been repeating over and over and over again for the weeks leading up to his trip to Jerusalem and his crucifixion. And clearly everything in the first 14 verses is designed to manifest Jesus. That's what verses 1 and 14 says. What these men are seeing about Jesus is that even though they failed him, even though Peter denied him, Jesus is doing some of the same things he did before in their lives, and he wants them to see his sacrificial service, and he wants to really nourish their souls, not just their physical appetites. And this is the resurrected Christ we're seeing here. This is the man that Thomas called my Lord and my God back in chapter 20. This is a picture of God we're seeing this morning, men and women. And it says in verse 12 that none of the disciples durst ask him, who art thou? In other words, they knew who he was, but it's almost like they kind of wanted it confirmed. They still were a little nervous or uncertain around Jesus, but they know it's Jesus. And Jesus comes and takes this bread and he feeds them and he draws them in. Men and women, this is your resurrected Lord. This is how he views you when you have the same kind of moments Peter's had. When you've had those moments where you haven't stood, when you had those moments you have failed, when you had those moments you've even perhaps denied the Lord, you find Jesus working to restore a fallen disciple. He will often set the stage just like this in your life. He will remind you of his faithfulness and his past dealings with you in similar circumstances, recalling to you other times when he has worked. It's all designed to draw you to his loving care. And for Peter, all that's going to result, listen carefully, it's all going to result, we'll see this in a few weeks, in a very public and a very painful time of questioning. There's going to be a time of probing in front of these men that I think Peter in some respects wishes he could just hide under a rock and there's nowhere to hide. Jesus is kind of pinning them to the wall in some respects, and we'll see that in a few weeks. But in the end, all these gracious circumstances and public questions, they're designed to humble the man and help him see that his priorities were all wrong. So what about you this morning? What work is God doing in your life? Perhaps even as I've been preaching, there have been some memories come up into your mind that the Spirit of God has pointed and said, you know what, God has worked in this time in your life and worked this time in your life. And you can tell me the age you were, you can tell me what, where you were located or what was going on in your life. You're going, yep, God's done that in my life. He's reminding me again that he's my shepherd. He's been faithful to me. He's done it. It may be over the past few days. God has allowed you to be reminded of those things. Well, I want to encourage you that when God does that, he often is preparing you for another step in your pilgrimage, another opportunity to be used by the Lord. However, you must be aware that many times on occasions like that, Jesus often does address something in your life, something that needs to be strengthened, sometimes something that needs to be corrected. Sometimes it's public, sometimes it's private. It might be painful to have to confront, but that's what the Lord is doing. And it's all part of his promise to you. It's all part of his grace, his faithfulness to you. But the question will be the same with Peter. Are you going to respond with the same humility? Are you going to respond with the same humility? And if you are willing to respond with that humility, here's what you will find. You will find Jesus moves you past the failure. He recovers you and allows you to continue to be useful in ways perhaps you never dreamed possible, just as Peter was used of the Lord. All right, we're going to leave it there this week. In a few weeks, we'll come back and pick up the confrontation. But I want to assure you that whatever failures you may be facing in your life, whatever difficulties, whatever fears you have, the Lord is not done with you. He continues to reclaim you, pursue you, as we repent, as we humble ourselves before his word. Let's close in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the testimony of Peter. We thank you for what we see manifested in Jesus, our shepherd. And I pray today that you would encourage us, that you would strengthen us. I pray today, Father, that our faith would be fastened upon Christ. And it is our prayer that there would be hope, there would be joy, there would be peace that would be found as we keep our eyes on him. And it is our prayer today that you would allow us truly to enter into the same sense that Peter has experienced of knowing it is the Lord who's at work and knowing that he continues to have purposes for our lives. We pray this in Jesus' name.